Hi everyone. I'm glad all of you could join us. My name is Matt, and I'm the president of Students for Life of CSULB. Before we begin, I want to give a quick shout out to our vice president, Adrian Urias, for arranging this event, and our treasurer, Eduardo Valenzuela, for his other behind the scene efforts. So today we're joined by our special guest, Dr. Calum Miller. Calum is a medical doctor based in the UK, and he graduated from the University of Oxford in 2015. Right now, he's working part-time clinically and is a research associate at the University of Oxford, researching abortion ethics and policy. And he's spoken and debated in many countries around the world, including on the BBC and to several governments. Today, Calum will be giving a presentation on the negative effects of abortion on women. Calum, thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Are you good for me to start?
Yeah, before you begin your presentation, do you want to briefly explain to us how you became pro-life?
Sure. Yeah, so I didn't grow up in a particularly religious family, and it was a family that never ever spoke about these sorts of issues. So even to this day, I barely have any idea what.
Hello, everybody. Give it the background noise.
So yeah, it was really being at medical school that I found that the arguments were really persuasive. It was being in contact with people who thought differently, people who were very reflective and thoughtful, and also just seeing at medical school the reality of unborn life and seeing the reality of abortion. Really all of those things together, looking at it, knowing the embryology and the way the baby develops in the womb, knowing what abortion does and how it impacts the baby and impacts women, and also just thinking very carefully about the ethical arguments really just convinced me to be pro-life. And so I completely understand those people who haven't necessarily heard the arguments or have never really thought about it and might have a different view, because I was in that position as well. But I hope that anyone who does have a different view will at least be open-minded and will look at the evidence and listen to the arguments, because that's what really convinced me.
Awesome. It's good to see doctors standing up for the unborn. You should have the option to share your screen, and you can begin when you're ready. And also, if anyone has any questions that they want to ask Calum, you can just type into the chat box, or you can wait towards the end, and we'll try to answer as many as we can.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll be around for however long people, well, not absolutely indefinitely, but I'll stay around for a good period of time afterwards to answer any questions that people might have. Can you see my screen? Is that working?
Yeah, we can see it.
Great. Okay.
Yes.
So what I want to talk about today is not necessarily the ethics of abortion, which was the kind of central question that convinced me to be pro-life, but thinking about what actually it is that abortion does to women. Abortion is obviously often seen as a thing that has been liberating for women, as a fundamental centerpiece and foundation of the equality of women, particularly in the US. That standpoint has been made very clear, and of course was a central part of the Roe v. Wade ruling. The abortion debate is a little bit different in England. So although far more people are pro-choice, almost everyone in England is pro-choice, they nevertheless are generally a bit more moderate in their pro-choice position. So almost no one thinks that abortion should be legal up to birth in England, for example. There are a few people, but they're generally seen actually as extremists and radicals, even by pro-choice people in England. Whereas I understand that view is quite popular in the US. And of course, Roe v. Wade guarantees a right up to birth for a very broad definition of health, which in theory can really include anything. And so the backgrounds are quite different, and I can talk a little bit more later if you want about the differences between the countries. But as I say, I want to focus today on the impact of abortion on women, because it's been seen as a centerpiece of women's liberation. And the more I've looked into the evidence on this, the more I found that in a number of different ways, in quite a diverse range of ways, abortion really hasn't served as a tool of liberation for women. And so I'm just going to go through a few of those ways in which I think abortion has harmed women, not only not helping women. One of the helpful ways to think about this question is with a quote from Desmond Tutu, who was central to ending apartheid and then the reconciliation process after apartheid in South Africa in the 1990s. He says this about how humans relate to each other and what justice involves. He says, my humanity is caught up and is bound up in theirs, in someone else's. We are diminished when others are humiliated or diminished, when others are tortured or oppressed or treated as if they were less than who they are. What dehumanizes you inexorably dehumanizes me. What he's saying there is that when it comes to justice, when it comes to the violation of human rights of the most vulnerable people, this doesn't just affect the most vulnerable people. This has a ripple effect throughout society. It involves a dehumanization, not only of that vulnerable group, but a dehumanization of everyone, whether the people involved or the people who are really closely related to the decision in some way, but also people all throughout society. And we'll see shortly how the legalization of abortion has caused those ripple effects and led to the dehumanization not only of unborn children, but also the dehumanization and poor treatment of many, many other people in society, especially women. Justice means treating people equally and treating them with dignity, and it means restoration of relationship. And so I want to argue that when unborn children are harmed through abortion, it's not only they who are harmed, but also their families and their societies, and in particular, their mothers. Abortion is about a breakdown of relationship between the mother and child, but also between the child and society, between the mother and society. Because as we know, abortion is often the result of a failure from society and a failure from men in particular to look after women and to treat them with respect that they are owed. And so I want to think about justice as a way of restoring relationship and mending and healing relationships. And what that means is that a just outcome is one that is good for everyone involved. It doesn't try and weigh one person's rights against another person's rights. It tries to say, how do we restore these relationships in a way that dignifies both people involved? And so one way to sum this up is to say that both lives matter. Both the child's life matters and the mother's life matter. We don't want to get into a false dichotomy of thinking that only the mother's life matters, or only her career matters, or only her circumstances matter. But we also don't want to go to the other extreme of only thinking about the baby and thinking that the mother is unimportant. We want to say that both of them are infinitely valuable and have to be treated with the utmost dignity and respect. And as I'll share, abortion has been harmful for women, and therefore it follows that women deserve better than abortion. Society has an obligation and a duty to give women a better alternative than abortion. One of the reasons compassion and treating women with dignity and respect in this debate is so important is because abortion is so common. In the UK, 1 in 3 women have an abortion in their lifetime, and the rate in California is significantly higher than in the UK. In the UK, there are 200,000 abortions a year. In the US, as you'll probably know, there are between 800,000 to 1 million abortions every year. And as I say, this works out to about 1 in 3 women in their lifetime in the UK, and probably the number is pretty similar in California. It's much lower in the southern states and in kind of the Midwest and so on. But within kind of the more liberal states in the US, this number is about proportionate. And hence compassion is of the utmost importance, because in pretty much every situation that we're in, we will come across people who either have had an abortion or who will have an abortion. And that means that we have to be talking with the utmost dignity and respect for women who might be put in this position or who have been in this position. So the first way that I think abortion has been harmful for women is an issue that has not been particularly common in the Western world, but in other countries, particularly India and to a large extent China, this has had a huge impact on the place of women in society. This topic is, of course, sex-selective abortion, where a baby is aborted not for any of the usual reasons, but simply because they are of the wrong sex. And in the overwhelming majority of cases, this is because the baby is a baby girl. This obviously is a reflection of the way in which women are degraded and seen as lesser in society. But it has one of its most important impacts through the issue of abortion. It's estimated that there are 1.6 to 1.7 million sex-selective abortions every year throughout the world. And as I say, the overwhelming majority of these are baby girls. And that doesn't just have an impact on those particular 1.6 to 1.7 million baby girls. It has ripple effects throughout all of society. So, for example, it's been pointed out that this has led to a significant increase in sex trafficking and bride trafficking in India and in China. In many parts of India, the sex ratio between men and women is so disparate. There's such an enormous gap between the number of men or number of boys and number of girls being born that actually this has led to a huge demand for sex slavery, for women being kidnapped and transported across India and other parts of the world because of the lack of women in those societies. And so what this means is that sex selective abortion is one of the most powerful ways that the patriarchy has of limiting the voice of women in society and limiting their visibility and ultimately limiting their very presence. This doesn't just have an impact, of course, in countries like India and China. The impact of sex trafficking and sex slavery is felt all over the world, including in the West. And we know that in Western countries, sex selective abortion does happen, not quite to the same extent, but still in a way that undermines the place of women in society. Just a few years ago, it was found that the ability to screen earlier for gender within the womb was leading to sex selective abortion of girls in the United Kingdom. This was from one of our leading far left newspapers, The Independent, and it was talking about how the ability to screen for gender earlier in the womb was leading to the abortion of baby girls in particular. And one of our major political parties, the Labour Party, called for a ban on the misuse of this screening to perform sex selective abortions. But this is very odd because there was an opportunity to ban the misuse of this screening for sex selective abortions just a couple of years earlier. We had a vote in our parliament which was simply to ban sex selective abortion, to say that you can have an abortion for pretty much any reason in the UK, but not just because the baby is a girl. And actually, the ban didn't succeed. Parliament voted against it. They voted to keep sex selective abortion legal. And in fact, this political party overwhelmingly voted to keep sex selective abortion legal. It was only a couple of years later that they seemed to realize what a mistake they had made and that sex selective abortion was happening in the UK. The second way in which abortion has been harmful for women is through the issue of coercion. And it's important here, I think, to be careful about what we're claiming. Sometimes pro-lifers can, to some extent, exaggerate on this issue, and they can say in fairly ambiguous ways that most women are forced into abortions. And I think we have to be a bit more careful about what we're saying here. It is true in a sense that most women are forced into abortions or pressured at least into abortions. What I mean by that is that soft pressure to have an abortion is extremely common. For example, 3/4 of pregnant women and new mothers in Scotland were found in a survey to experience maternity or pregnancy discrimination. We know that career reasons and education reasons are pretty much the main reasons for obtaining abortions in the UK and the US. But this seems to be obviously a result in part of the societal pressures for women to not have babies when they go to work or when they get a job and so on. As I say, the large majority of women having babies in the UK claim that they face discrimination for that. And in any other context, we would be happy, or we would be convinced to say that this was a form of pressure. And I think it follows, therefore, that the same is true in the case of abortion. Women are pressured to have abortions by their employers, by their career prospects, and so on. And a lot of this is because of the way society has been structured in a way that doesn't allow women to have children and to have a job. And that's a way that society has failed women. But there's also hard pressure and hard coercion to have an abortion, where women are outrightly intimidated or threatened or blackmailed to have an abortion. In one study in the US, they found that 64% of women felt pressured, and over half of them felt that they needed more time to make the decision. The Guttmacher Institute, which is perhaps the leading pro-abortion think tank in the world, found that 23% of women in the US said that one of their reasons for having an abortion was that their partner did not want the pregnancy. In Norway, which is often seen as one of the best countries in the world for gender equality, one of the Scandinavian or Nordic countries which progressives around the world look up to as the kind of beacon of gender equality and maternity support. In Norway, they found that 25% of women felt pressure from the male partner. And on average, these women described that as a great deal of pressure, not just a small amount of pressure from their partner. Likewise, in Sweden, perhaps the leading country in the world for gender equality, they found that there were overwhelmingly negative attitudes towards teenagers giving birth. And Swedish teenagers overwhelmingly described that when they became pregnant, even when they wanted to have the baby, they were faced with enormous pressure to end the pregnancy, usually from the male partner, but often sometimes from their parents as well. We see more concrete examples of this, not just hard pressure from family members or from male partners, but also pressure from abortion providers themselves. Marie Stopes International is one of the leading abortion providers around the world. It's one of the leading abortion providers in the UK. They now changed their name to MSI, just shorten that into an acronym, because Marie Stopes was a well-known, notorious eugenicist, and they wanted to kind of escape those ties. And so they renamed their organization from Marie Stopes International to MSI, which of course stands for the same thing, but is supposed to remove the name of this notorious eugenicist. As I say, this is one of the leading abortion providers in the entire world. Well, they've been looked at in the UK by the hospital regulators. This is not a kind of undercover pro-life investigation. It's not a journalistic operation. These are just the normal hospital regulators in the UK. And these hospital regulators most likely are full of pro-choice people, as most people in the UK are. And when these hospital regulators go to hospitals, as I've experienced in my own practice, hospitals are on their very best behavior. They do everything right to try and make sure that they're putting on a good front for the inspectors. Well, even when the abortion provider was on its best behavior, the hospital regulators found really concerning instances of pressure on women to have abortions. They said staff expressed concern that they were assessed and bonuses were paid based on their performance. Now that seems very ordinary in and of itself, but what they also found is that one of the performance indicators was whether a woman went ahead with an abortion or decided not to have one in the end. And they found that when women decided to go ahead with an abortion, that was a good outcome, and staff were paid bonuses for the outcome. And staff described, these are pro-abortion staff working for an abortion provider, they described this as working against the concept of patient choice. Moreover, the inspectors found that there was a target for women going ahead with abortions, and this target was 98 to 100%. In other words, if a woman went to see if she could have an abortion, but decided against it in the end and decided that her choice was to keep the baby, this was considered a failure by the abortion provider, and this was considered as not meeting the abortion provider's targets. Moreover, there was a particularly concerning line in the report, and it spoke about this a little bit more, that said consent was routinely accepted from children without proper assessment of their ability to understand the risks. Now, anyone who works in healthcare knows that uninformed consent is not valid consent at all. And what this means is that invalid consent was routinely accepted from children, and therefore abortions were routinely performed on children without valid consent. And this, of course, can only be described as a kind of pressure or coercion. Now, coerced abortion is widely agreed by pretty much everyone in the world to be a very serious human rights abuse. It's described as a brutal form of discrimination by one of the UN treaty body committees. The Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, which is a radically pro-abortion entity, said that the practice of forced abortions needs to be criminalized by every country. And one of the UN special rapporteurs has said that forced abortion on disabled people is a form of torture and violates the UN Convention Against Torture. So this is widely agreed to be a very, very serious human rights abuse. And of course, the US has placed sanctions on certain countries in recent times for performing forced abortions on women. But this isn't just something that occurs in notorious countries with very poor human rights records. In fact, this is something that occurs in the West as well. This was a case just a couple of years ago in the UK. This was described mostly in the media, and it was difficult to get information on this because of all the safeguarding, anonymity, and so on. But it emerged a couple of years ago that there was a case where a woman was in her 20s and she was 22 weeks pregnant. Now, at 22 weeks, it's possible, it's usually not likely, but it is possible for a baby to be born and to survive and to go on to live a mostly healthy life. So this was a lady who was very, very far advanced in her pregnancy and whose baby was viable. She was in her 20s, but she did have a mild to moderate learning disability. And there have been varying reports about just how serious that was. But this wasn't a lady who was, for example, completely unable to communicate her opinions. This was a lady who was able to communicate her opinions, who clearly said that she wanted to keep the baby and who understood that she was pregnant. The doctors decided that despite the fact that she wanted the baby, despite the fact that her mother in turn was a midwife who was happy and willing to look after the baby and who was a devout Catholic, despite the fact that the social worker for the family agreed that the baby would be looked after, and social workers in the UK are very, very often pro-choice. Despite all of this evidence, doctors decided that they knew better than the woman and that this woman should have an abortion. And of course, the woman protested, the family protested, because all of them thought that the pregnancy should continue. But the doctors were so adamant that they knew best and that this woman should be forced to have an abortion that they took the woman to court. And the court judged this, and the judge said that the evidence showed the woman wanted to keep the baby. There was no dispute about this. But the judge said an abortion should still be carried out against the choice of the woman. And to try and placate the woman, to try and appease her who didn't want to have the abortion, the doctors told her that instead of the baby, she would be given a new doll to play with after having the abortion. Now, the good news in this situation is that on the morning that the abortion, or on the day that the abortion was due to take place, that morning, the family received funds to challenge to a higher court and go to a court of appeal. And the court of appeal mercifully overturned the initial ruling, and now the baby has been born and is, as far as we know, very safe and well loved by her family. But unless that last minute legal challenge succeeded and unless the family received that funding, this would have taken place. And we do know that there have been other situations pretty much exactly the same where abortions have gone ahead. So forced abortion is not just something that you hear of in countries with very, very poor human rights records in other parts of the world. Forced abortion is a part of the Western world. The third way in which abortion has been generally harmful to women, I'll argue, is through the mechanism of mental health and the impact that abortion has on a woman's mental health. Now, it's often claimed that abortion is necessary for a woman's mental health, and that abortion is a fundamental part of a woman's well-being, and that when women are denied abortions or where they don't have abortions for unwanted pregnancies, they will have significant psychological trauma or psychological harm as a result. Well, David Ferguson was the leading authority in the world on this topic. He himself was pro-choice. He thought that pro-lifers were a nuisance, in his words. He was very annoyed by them. And he was very clear that he thought it was a woman's right to abort if she wanted to. But he held, as a psychologist, the evidence simply didn't support this idea that abortion helped a woman's mental health. He said that at the present time, there is no credible scientific evidence demonstrating that abortion has mental health benefits. In fact, his research is widely agreed by pretty much all the major reviews to be the best research in the world on this topic. So no one is doubting his research, the quality of his research, the integrity or sincerity of him as an individual. And yet he is very, very clear that there is no evidence that abortion has mental health benefits. In fact, he said the opposite. He said that when you look at all the best studies and you group their results together, there's a 30% increased risk of anxiety from an abortion, a 70% increased risk of suicidal behavior, and even higher increased risks of alcohol misuse and drug misuse. Now, when David Ferguson found these sorts of findings, he was actually asked by his government in New Zealand not to publish them because they thought that the results would be, in their words, misused by pro-lifers. Of course, this is just what the objective empirical evidence shows, but the authorities didn't want these results to be made public, which goes some way towards showing why it is that there still remains so much debate about this topic. There is a pretty active and pretty blatant suppression of this sort of research. But nevertheless, the empirical evidence is clear that abortion is associated with worse mental health outcomes. Now, the main response to this will usually be to say that this is because women who are seeking abortion have worse mental health in the first place. Women who have poorer mental health maybe are more likely to get into situations where they have an unwanted pregnancy, and because they have poorer mental health, they also feel less able to cope with that pregnancy, and therefore they're more likely to have an abortion. Well, the problem with this response is that all of this was taken into account by Ferguson's research and by the research of the other authors who he includes in his reviews. This is all taken into account, and he found that even when you take all of these factors into account, as well as all the other factors like the woman's socioeconomic status, whether she's experienced domestic abuse and so on, even when all of that is accounted for, abortion is still associated with a significantly worse set of mental health outcomes. And this is very compelling evidence that abortion is what causes those mental health negative effects. Now, this has an important impact on the mortality of women after pregnancy and after abortion. I'm not going to speak a great deal about the argument from maternal mortality in general, but I will say a couple of quick words about it. It is sometimes claimed that and I'm sure many of you will be familiar with this argument, that before abortion was legalized, thousands of women were dying from backstreet abortions, and that because abortion was legalized, these women were all saved by being able to have a safe, legal abortion. Well, the evidence just doesn't bear this out, and this is a whole other lecture in itself, which I'd be more than happy to speak about another time. Essentially, what the evidence shows is no clear trend between abortion legalization and maternal mortality. In the overwhelming majority of countries, when abortion is legalized, the maternal mortality rate continues falling as it was falling before abortion was legalized. In fact, when some countries go the opposite direction, like Chile and Poland, and ban abortion, the same trend is seen, that the maternal mortality rate continues to go down. So there really doesn't seem to be any significant association at all. In fact, some countries see a significant increase in maternal mortality or in abortion mortality and abortion complications when abortion is legalized. In Ethiopia, for example, it was estimated that once abortion was legalized, this led to a massive increase in the number of abortions, but no decrease in the number of illegal abortions. Exactly the same number of women were having illegal abortions as before. The only difference was that a load of extra women were having legal abortions. And so the mortality didn't seem to decrease at all. And in fact, the evidence suggests that more women were being admitted to hospital with serious complications from abortion after it was legalized. Likewise, in South Africa, the maternal mortality rate tripled once abortion was legalized. And in Holland, the number of deaths specifically from abortion increased massively when abortion was liberalized in the 1960s. And those are just a few examples. There are more examples besides those. But all I'll say there is that this argument, for a wide range of reasons, simply doesn't work. There's no evidence really to suggest that abortion legalization makes maternity safer or leads to fewer women dying from backstreet abortions. So what I do want to talk about at a little bit greater length is the question of mortality after a legal abortion compared to mortality after continuing a pregnancy. It's sometimes claimed, and you'll find this claimed by abortion advocates, particularly in the US, that abortion is many times abortion is many times safer than giving birth. So they say that the complications from abortion are very rare and hardly anyone dies from abortion when it's legal. But death from pregnancy is somewhat common. It does happen, it's still very rare, but it's significantly more common than death after abortion. Well, one of the reasons people are able to make this claim is because they count maternal deaths in completely inconsistent ways. So, for example, suicide is counted as a maternal death after a pregnancy. If a woman has a baby and later commits suicide, that is counted as a death resulting from the pregnancy. But if a woman has an abortion and then commits suicide, this is not counted as a death from abortion. And so what this does is it inflates the number of deaths from pregnancy while keeping the number of deaths from abortion completely unchanged. Now, the reason this is so important is because suicide is actually the leading cause of maternal death. It accounts for by far the largest number of deaths after pregnancy and the number of deaths after abortion. It's the second largest cause of maternal deaths within 6 weeks of the pregnancy, and it's the leading cause of maternal deaths if you take that all the way up to a year after the end of a pregnancy. But the suicide rate after abortion is much, much higher than the suicide rate after delivering a baby. Here's an example from Finland. This is recent data from Finland where abortion is not really stigmatized at all. It's a very, very progressive society. It's had abortion legalized for many, many years, and it has very good data collection. What's been found in Finland and published in a very reputable journal is that the suicide rate for a woman who's become pregnant is actually much, much lower than average. And the reason for this is well known. It's because suicide and looking after a child are some of the strongest protective factors against a woman committing suicide. By contrast, if a woman has an abortion, the suicide rate doesn't just go up back to average, but goes far, far higher. And so the suicide rate after abortion is about 6 to 7 times higher than the suicide rate after continuing a pregnancy. Now, it is worth saying that abortion isn't responsible for all of that increase in the suicide rate. In fact, it's not responsible for most of that increase in suicide rate. Most of that difference is because women who have abortions are more likely to have more mental health difficulties in the first place. But as the evidence I presented before from David Ferguson shows, abortion is associated and responsible for a significant number of suicides. And therefore, abortion does contribute to this significantly bigger suicide rate or significantly higher suicide rate among women who have abortions. And as I said, because suicide is the leading cause of maternal death and the leading cause of death after abortion, this means that the mortality rate after abortion is much, much higher than the mortality rate after pregnancy. Now, you might think this is a bit unfair because most of those deaths from abortion are the result of suicide, some of which is due to pre-existing factors. And you might say, well, on a purely physical level, pregnancy is more dangerous. But actually, as the authors show in this study and in many other studies from Finland, even when you only look at physical causes of death, the mortality rate from pregnancy and the mortality rate from abortion are pretty much the same. And so this doesn't support the idea that pregnancy is much, much more dangerous than abortion. One of the other ways in which abortion has been harmful for women is through an increased risk of preterm birth. Now, I want to preface this a little bit by saying that pro-lifers have, if I may say so, sometimes been responsible for slightly exaggerated claims and for not very carefully checking some of the claims that they make about the impact of abortion on women. It's often claimed, for example, that there's a link between abortion and breast cancer. I won't speak about that at all because it's an area that I haven't looked into, I haven't researched. And so I only want to focus on things where there is very, very clear evidence. While this means that I can't talk about every single area, what it does mean is that when I do talk about an area such as preterm birth, it's because the evidence is very, very compelling and it's actually widely agreed, no matter your political position. So, for example, there doesn't seem to be any dispute within the academic literature that abortion is associated with an increased risk of preterm birth. Now, this increase is quite significant. For women who have only one abortion, the increased risk is about 30%. If a woman has more than one abortion, the increase in risk is about 50 to 90%. Now, actually, it's true that in places like the UK and California, most women who have an abortion will go on to have another abortion. So women having more than one abortion is actually the majority of women who have abortions. And therefore, most women who have abortions will be at this very significantly higher risk of preterm birth in the future. When you look at very early preterm births, so people or babies who were born before 32 weeks, this is extremely early in pregnancy and is associated with significantly more complex health conditions as a result. The increase in risk from abortion is even higher still. Now, some authorities will try to say that there is clearly a link between preterm birth and abortion, but there's not sufficient evidence that this is a causal relationship. There's not sufficient evidence yet that abortion is causing the preterm births. Now, I think this is very, very unlikely, and you'll notice none of the authorities straightforwardly deny that there is a causal relationship. The most that they will say is we don't have enough evidence yet. And in fact, one of the main groups that says this sort of thing, the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists in the UK, the only mechanism they offer for this relationship is because of trauma to the woman's cervix during an abortion. And so although they deny that the abortion is what's causing the preterm birth in future, or they say there's insufficient evidence, the only explanation they actually offer for why this relationship might exist is a causal relationship, namely that abortion causes trauma to the woman's reproductive tract, and this results in preterm birth later on. Now, this is responsible for, it's been estimated, it's responsible for about 23,000 extra very early preterm births in the USA every year. That's early births before 32 weeks of pregnancy. And in turn, this is responsible for about 2,000 extra cases of cerebral palsy, which of course has a number of significant impacts on both the child and on their family who have to support the child with cerebral palsy, which can of course come in very differing levels of complexity. But it's also been estimated that even just for these initial neonatal costs, that is, just when you're looking after the baby who is born very early, those costs are $1.2 billion extra every year, just as a result of abortion. That doesn't include any of the costs associated with the long-term health conditions that can arise from preterm birth. This is just from the initial neonatal care, and likely the expenditure as a result from of preterm birth from abortion is significantly higher. Now, it's somewhat difficult for many people to see why this is such a significant issue, especially if you don't have any sort of familiarity with having had a baby very early or having a close friend or family member who's had a baby very early. But in fact, the WHO suggests that complications from preterm birth are the leading cause of death among children under the age of 5. And this is responsible for about 1 million deaths a year around the world. So preterm birth is a really significant health problem. It's a really significant problem for babies and the children and adults they grow up into. And of course, it's a very significant problem for the parents and the mothers who look after babies with these challenging health conditions. And so this is a very, very significant problem. And the evidence seems increasingly clear that it is very much caused by abortion. Another way, and we're coming towards the end now, that abortion has been detrimental to the status and well-being of women is through the impact of abortion on sexually transmitted diseases. Now, no one is claiming here that abortion directly causes sexually transmitted diseases. There is some evidence that some contraceptives, for example, can increase a risk of certain STDs. As far as I'm aware, there's no evidence that abortion directly increases the risk of STDs. I know the point about contraception is counterintuitive, but this is, I can explain that in the Q&A if you're puzzled by it. What abortion does do, however, is it changes the sexual behavior of a society. what abortion legalization does is it causes people to change the way they behave around the opposite sex and the way they behave when it comes to their sexual lives. And in particular, it causes people to have much riskier sex, which here is intended to mean sex with people with whom they would not want to have a baby, or sex at a time where if pregnancy were to occur, they would not want to have the baby. If abortion is readily available and legal, that offers a backup option to people who are having sex. So whereas before abortion was legalized, people would be more cautious about having sex because they knew that it could cause a pregnancy and this would cause significant disruption to their lives. If abortion is available, that acts as an insurance option, and therefore people feel like they can have sex with whoever they want, whenever they want, no matter what their circumstances are. And as a result, they can always have an abortion if they do become pregnant. And so abortion, it's been shown empirically many, many times, has led to a significant change in the way that people have sex. Now, for many people, this will seem like a great thing, having sex without any sort of strings attached or responsibilities, having sex in a way that is liberated from the possibility of reproduction is seen as an extremely liberating thing. And of course, you don't have to look very far in society to see that many people do see it that way. But of course, this comes with its costs at the same time. And it's been found that the increase in risky sex from the legalization of abortion is associated with a massive increase in the transmission of sexually transmitted diseases. It's been shown, for example, that that abortion has been responsible for a 60% increase in gonorrhea transmission. And if you extrapolate to other sexually transmitted diseases, you might find the same trends. Now, even for gonorrhea alone, again, for people who have not had much familiarity with it, it's not obvious why this is such a significant thing. But we know, I mean, many people know that gonorrhea is associated with significant outcomes for people, and particularly it's associated with significant outcomes for women. So the complications of gonorrhea include pelvic inflammatory disease, which can cause a lot of pain for many, many years for women and can eventually result in infertility. It can cause ectopic pregnancies, which are life-threatening, and which again can also result in infertility depending on the way in which it's treated. I think that's less common now. Gonorrhea can cause miscarriages in the future, and it can cause premature labor in the future. Now, you'll notice that most of those apply only to women. Men don't get ectopic pregnancies, they don't have miscarriages, they don't go into premature labor, and so on. This is a way in which the legalization of abortion has specifically impacted on women and has significantly disadvantaged women relative to men in society. Now, it's estimated that this increase in gonorrhea from abortion legalization costs the US about $300 million a year. But when you extrapolate to all the other sexually transmitted diseases, including particularly chlamydia, syphilis, and HIV/AIDS, this cost is enormously increased. And it's been suggested that $4 billion is spent in the US each year just as a result of treating STDs, which wouldn't have occurred if abortion had not been legalized. And so this is a really significant financial cost, but of course it's also a really significant health cost. For many women, they might become infertile, for example, which is an extremely distressing and difficult challenge for many women to navigate. In some cases, it's even more serious still. If abortion is likewise associated with an increase in HIV transmission and therefore the development of AIDS, this of course can be a fatal condition. We're fortunate in the Western world that AIDS is now relatively treatable, and most people do survive if they're diagnosed early on. But of course, some people do tragically lose their lives to HIV/AIDS, and in other parts of the world, many, many thousands more people lose their lives to HIV/AIDS. And this is something that has been significantly facilitated by the legalization of abortion. And then finally, then, before we get into some questions, I want to talk a little bit about something that will inevitably come across as a little bit more controversial, but it's something that I think is at least worth reflecting on. What I say might come across as very conservative. I'll argue that it's not necessarily very conservative in a moment, but it's something that I think all of us need to think about. What we've learned in the last few years is that the way that we behave sexually, the way we behave in relationships, the way that we behave outside of relationships when it comes to the matter of sex is extremely important. And if we misuse sex, it can have a profoundly devastating impact on people's lives. And again, we've seen, especially in the last few years, that women have been negatively affected by this to a significant and disproportionate extent. It's very, very often women who bear the burdens of people misusing sex. Now, this isn't to say before abortion was legalized, there were no such problems. Of course, before abortion was legalized, there was still a lot of people misusing sex in horrendous ways at times, whether through sexual assault or sexual violence and so on. But the evidence is now increasingly clear that the way in which sexual behavior has changed since abortion was legalized has had a disproportionately negative impact on women in particular. And there are two ways in which this has been the case. So, as I argued earlier, if abortion is legalized, this leads to a significant increase in uncommitted sex. People having sex when they're not ready to commit to a person, they're not ready to commit to a child potentially, and so on. What this does is, firstly, it leads to breakdown of families. We've seen the effects of this throughout the Western world with a massive increase in parental separation, divorce, and all the negative effects that can come from that. And uncommitted sex also leads to unwanted pregnancies. If people are having more sex in situations where they don't want to become pregnant, it's inevitable that there will be more unwanted pregnancies. And of course, who is it that bears the burdens of unwanted pregnancy? No matter what a woman decides, an unwanted pregnancy is still a very, very challenging thing for a woman to go through. And you only need to listen to the accounts of a few women to know this. But all those burdens, whether it's the burdens of pregnancy and child rearing, perhaps single motherhood, or whether it's the burdens of going for an abortion and the mental health impact and distress that can be caused by that, these burdens overwhelmingly fall on the shoulders of women, where men can just pack up their bags and leave and say, this is not my responsibility. Women have no such option. And so this uncommitted sex that has proliferated in the culture since the legalization of abortion has been something which has significantly liberated men so that they can do pretty much anything they want. By contrast, women, while in some cases enjoying the liberation that has come from this sort of culture, women have also been burdened with the counterweight of unwanted pregnancy in a way that has not impacted men to any significant extent. And what all of this means is that uncommitted sex has a disproportionate impact on women, and especially poor women, who are the most vulnerable to the challenges of the family breakdown and the challenges of unwanted pregnancy. I said that this was going to sound like a very conservative point of view, and for some of you, maybe it does sound like an extremely conservative point of view. I want to offer just a brief challenge to that. This was a paper published in 1996, which, if you read it, will sound like it maybe, again, comes from a very conservative point of view. It talks about 25 years previously, in the 1970s, abortion was legalized, and this led to a significant number of social problems, including poverty, which until that point looked like it was going to be eradicated in the US. They said over the last 25 years, disturbing trends have occurred in the US and other Western countries. At the same time, about 1970, that the permanent cure to poverty seemed to be on the horizon. And just at the time that women had obtained the tools to control the number and the timing of their children, single motherhood and the feminization of poverty, by which they mean a massive increase in women in particular entering poverty, began their long and steady rise. As a result, United States poverty rates have been stubbornly constant for the last quarter century. So what they're saying is that the sexual culture, which was generated from the legalization of abortion has led to massive increases in single motherhood, and as a result of that, massive increases in women who are in poverty. Now, the twist here is that this paper was authored by a Nobel Prize-winning economist, George Akerlof, and his wife, Janet Yellen. Now, some of you, maybe most of you, have heard of Janet Yellen because she is President Biden's new Secretary of the Treasury, a formidable and extremely well-credentialed cabinet member who has formidable credentials as an economist. You don't need to be a raging Republican, right-wing, pro-family fanatic to see some of the detrimental impacts that this sort of change in the culture has had on women, and the detrimental impact that this has had on poor women in particular, and the way in which it has pushed women into poverty. This comes straight from the mouth of President Biden's Secretary of the Treasury, and is very, very difficult to dispute empirically. I'll just say a couple more things about this, because for some people it can be a little bit unclear why family breakdown and why these sorts of outcomes are so bad, and in particular so bad for women. We know, and there's very good empirical evidence, that family breakdown, particularly parental separation, is associated with a wide range of negative outcomes for both parents and their children, including suicide rates for the mother and the father, and suicide rates for the children. We know that parental separation leads to a wide variety of problems for children, including violent crime and delinquency as they grow up. Now, what this means is that children who grow up in broken homes, while of course in many cases turn out to be extremely well-rounded and incredible individuals, and none of us would ever want to deny this, at the same time, of course, many people who grow up in very, very good homes grow up to be extremely nasty individuals who are capable of committing heinous acts. Nevertheless, the empirical evidence is quite clear that there is a risk from parental separation and family breakdown that is commuted to the children, that those children are more likely to begin those negative behaviors, which of course in turn have a negative impact on women, particularly when it comes to male violence and the perpetration of male violence. At the same time, of course, the decline in marriage and the decline of stable relationships for forming families has been associated with a significant increase in child poverty and inequality in particular. George Akerlof, who is the Nobel Prize-winning economist and husband of Janet Yellen, the Secretary of the Treasury, he argued that these changes in society have also led to a number of other social pathologies, which he said arise from the extended adolescence of men. What he meant by that is that these changes in societal norms meant that men had no sort of pressure to commit to women at a younger age and to say, I will be a responsible person, I will be responsible for the sake of my partner, or I will be responsible for the sake of my child, and so on. Because men were delaying this way of holding them to accountability and responsibility, it meant that men were going through the same sort of behaviors they would do as teenagers, things like delinquency and so on, causing trouble, as men tend to do. But as men grow older, they become capable of far more significant crimes and far more significant problems. And therefore, Akerlof argued that this way of extending male irresponsibility by removing some of the main things that made them responsible in the first place was linked to a number of significant social pathologies, including particularly violent crime, of which, of course, we are well aware that women have been the main victims of from male violence. I'm not going to say much more about that. There's a load more that could be said, but I want to just close by putting it this way. David Brooks at The Atlantic said a couple of years ago that the market wants us to live alone. That way we are mobile, unattached, and uncommitted. What he means there is that the capitalist and corporate forces shaping so much of society want people to not be in relationships, whether relationships with people of the opposite sex, relationships with people of the same sex, relationships with children, whoever. It doesn't really matter. The corporate capitalist forces that shape society don't want people to be in committed relationships with anyone for the most part. Why is this? The reason is because when people become committed to partners or children, they invest huge amounts in those children. They work less, they contribute to the economy less in some cases. And this is bad for people at the very top of the food chain who just want to make money and who just want to gain more power. And so the people who are at the top of this kind of corporate oligarchy want us to be unattached from people. They don't want us to form meaningful relationships with other people. There are exceptions, of course. No one's denying that this is an absolute universal rule, but it is the general trend. And yet it's pretty clear that this is damaging to human well-being, because the clearest predictor of well-being is relationship. It's been shown by a Harvard study in particular over many, many years that the thing that most predicts whether someone is happy with their life is the quality and the meaning of the relationships that they have formed. And I've argued that it's precisely those relationships which are most meaningful to people and which most bring people happiness, which are so damaged by abortion. Whether it's the damage to relationship that's done through abortion itself, whether it's the damage that's done by the effect of abortion on the culture more generally, it doesn't really matter. The basic fact is that all of us now in the Western world are craving relationship and in many cases are completely unable to get it. And I've argued that much of this can be traced back to the roots in abortion and the way that that changed the culture in the 1970s. And so I'm going to finish there. I am well aware that I've gone on for plenty of time. I thank you very much for your patience. I'm sorry in particular that you had to listen to such a appalling English accent, but I'm very, very grateful for the patience that you've shared and your willingness to listen to these points. I should have said at the start, but I'll say now, if anyone has, of course, been offended by anything that I've said, please do let me know, and I'd be very much willing to apologize for any offense that I've caused. That was not my intention at all. I just wanted to share this perspective and share some of the ways in which, as a doctor and a researcher, I found that the narrative of abortion being a means of women's liberation has not quite been true and has not quite been supported by the empirical facts available. So thank you very much for listening.
Awesome. That was a great presentation, Calum. So we can start by answering a few questions right now. Anyone has any? If you guys have any questions, you can just type it in the chat. You can ask Calum directly. So I guess I'll start with my question. Can you explain the causal connection between abortion and gonorrhea? That part
I think I already posted one in the chat. I remember something right here.
Oh.
Go ahead. I lost my train of thought.
Yeah.
Sorry, Matt.
I'll answer both because I can see the one in the chat as well. So the question on gonorrhea first. Yeah. So as I said, as far as I know, there's no evidence that having an abortion means that that individual woman is more likely to contract gonorrhea, for example, or any other sexually transmitted disease. The way it works is that if abortion is available in a society, people are more likely to have sex with multiple partners. They're more likely to have unprotected sex and not use a barrier method such as a condom. And this has been well documented through empirical studies. And because people are having sex with more different people and they're having sex with people who they know less, and because they're having less sex with condoms, this means that they're more likely to contract sexually transmitted diseases and to spread those diseases around. The reason that abortion has that effect on sexual behavior is because if you imagine abortion is unavailable, you're going to be significantly more cautious about having sex with someone because you know there's a significant chance that they'll become pregnant or you'll become pregnant. And if you know that there's a really significant risk of someone becoming pregnant, you're more likely to be hesitant. You're not just going to enter the same sort of casual encounters that you might do otherwise. When that when abortion is legalized and abortion is available as an option, that sort of caution and hesitancy is removed. You don't need to be as hesitant because there is always the backup option of an abortion if someone does become pregnant. Now, I should clarify again, this is not a kind of universal rule. Of course, some people will have lots of sexual encounters and lots of unprotected sex, even when abortion is illegal. And of course, even when abortion is legal, some people will still be very cautious and not have any risky sex at all. But the general trend of society is that when abortion is legalized, people have riskier sex. And as a result, they spread and contract sexually transmitted infections more than they would otherwise. So Rachel, coming to your question, let me just read it. So yeah, talking about the impact of abortion on sexual culture, what are some ways that we can communicate this information to others when we may not have the time to sit down and explain it in the nuanced way that you have? I'd say it's very, very tricky to do so. As you know, I know England seems very prudish and very proper, but we have exactly the same sort of attitude towards sex as you do in California, that sex is a human right and you should be able to do it with whoever you want, however you want, whenever you want, as long as it's consensual. So certainly, you know, some of these points will be challenging to that perspective, and that perspective is, of course, the main perspective that we see in our respective societies. Of course, it's possible to be a pro-lifer and to think that sex should be this way, that people should be able to have sex with whoever they want, however they want. And nevertheless, you can think that abortion is something that undermines the human rights of the most vulnerable. That's completely possible. But I think it's always worth being thoughtful about what our sexual behavior, what impact that has on society. So probably maybe the easiest way that I'd think of for trying to explain it quickly, which is inevitably probably a bad idea given the sensitivity of the topic. Maybe the first kind of way I'd open up the conversation is to ask someone questions, and to ask them questions about what they think sex means, and how easy it is for sex to be misused. So you can ask them, do you think people are very often hurt by sex? Do you think sex has been harmful to people in some situations? Now, everyone will say, yes, it's been harmful to some people in some situations. But then you can say, well, how common are they? How often is it that someone has sex because they want to impress someone without necessarily having it because they wanted to have it of their own volition? How often is it that women are pressured or forced into sex or sexually harassed and so on? And so you can begin to ask, is there a problem with our sexual culture? And I think everyone would say, yes, there is a problem with our sexual culture. And by asking those questions and getting their thoughts first, you can begin to open up the door to saying, yes, there is a problem with our sexual culture, and allow them to think through more carefully, well, what are the roots of those problems? Yes, some of the roots, of course, lie in misogyny. Some of those roots lie in masculinity being taken to pathological extents, when men use their aggression in ways that are not protective for the most vulnerable, but when men use their aggression in ways that harm the most vulnerable. The problems with our sexual culture don't just come from abortion, obviously. They come from a number of different roots. But I think once you begin to ask people, where do they come from? And what are some situations you can think of where this has gone wrong? I think you can begin to talk about, how does abortion link into that? How does the idea of non-committed sex and men being able to have sex without any sort of commitment have a role to play in some of these dynamics that all of us think are really challenging and really pathological? So as I say, there's no easy way to do it quickly, just because it's such a delicate topic, particularly in cultures like ours. But I would always ask questions first. Questions are a great way of being gentle and inviting, and then try and get at it from the common ground where we all agree that there's a problem with the sexual culture, and then try to tease out some of the roots of that. So I hope that's a little bit helpful.
That actually helps a lot.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I had a question about the extended adolescence, like in young men. Is that like something more you can add to that?
Yeah. So this paper was a 1998 paper by George Akerlof. Just to recap, he was the Nobel Prize winning economist, and his wife is Biden's Secretary of the Treasury, Janet Yellen. So presumably he is also of a fairly progressive, left-leaning persuasion, though that's not, can't always assume these things. He wrote this essay, I think it's called Men Without Children. He talks about the example of children in particular, and he says that one of the main things that causes men to rein in their kind of instinctive delinquency, I think is a fair way of putting it, is the responsibility to look after children. Now, I think this can be extended more generally. I don't think it's children necessarily that cause men to do this, although they certainly do. Even just being in a relationship without children, I think, has a considerable taming impact on men. And so he argues that because men were able to now have sex without any sort of responsibility as a result of contraception and abortion put together, this meant that they could begin doing so. And they began to have sex, and if they got a woman pregnant, they were just able to say, okay, that's your problem, and walk away. They didn't have any sort of sense of needing to actually take responsibility if they got someone pregnant. Now, the thing that, and of course, yeah, as a result of that, they delayed having children because they wanted to go out and have fun. They didn't want to have that responsibility at an early age. And of course, because men and women have very different reproductive lifespans, women's fertility declines pretty quickly after 30 and particularly after 35, whereas men's fertility drops off very, very gradually over their life. Women who wanted to have children still had a bit of a deadline to have a family, whereas men didn't have any of the same sort of pressure. And so this created a kind of power imbalance, so that men felt that they didn't really have to take any responsibility for having children, and they could always just delay it indefinitely and say, in many, many years in the future, I'm going to have children, when that same option wasn't always available for women. And as a result of that, men continued the ways in which they'd behaving in their teenage years. So of course, you'll have some teenage boys in the USA who are very, very well behaved. I wasn't one of them. Well, I wasn't in the US, but nor was I well behaved. But on the whole, I think most of us would feel comfortable saying that teenage boys are a pain in the ass. They're a nuisance. And that's putting it gently and charitably. Of course, when those sorts of behaviors are exaggerated and when they go on into adulthood, they can become really extremely pathological. So when, for example, a teenage boy might slap a girl on the bum, as we'd say in England, that in England would not be seen. Obviously, the sexual etiquette has changed, and there's been a lot of awareness raising about this sort of thing in England. When I was a teenager, if you were in school and someone hit someone else on the bottom or the bum or whatever you call it in the US, I don't know, that was not seen as a particularly significant thing. But of course, if those behaviors are exaggerated and if those behaviors go on into adulthood, you can easily see the trend from that sort of low-grade sexual assault into far more serious kinds of sexual assault that are extremely traumatic for women. And so these are the sorts of things that he doesn't talk about it in this much detail, but those are the sorts of things that he might have in mind, where he says these sorts of behaviors that begin fairly young for boys, if boys are not given any sort of responsibility, they will become exaggerated and they will lead to significant social pathologies like violent crime and various other things. So the one caveat I'd say here, because I spoke to someone about this the other day, and they were very upset about the idea that they thought this was a way of saying men are going to misbehave unless women domesticate them. And they said this was a kind of way of pushing the responsibility onto women, whereas of course the responsibility for these behaviors is on the men. So I think it's important, if you talk about this sort of thing, to be clear, we're not at all saying that it's a woman's duty to make a man responsible, either by being in a relationship with him or by bearing children for him. That's absolutely not what we're saying. But what we are saying is that one of the tried and tested ways throughout centuries that does empirically make men more accountable and responsible is by having commitments to other people. And because men no longer have the same incentives to be committed to other people, this means that they don't have the same incentives to be responsible people. And therefore you see some of these, what Akerlof calls social pathologies, that have increased dramatically since the 1970s. I hope that was a reasonably clear way of explaining it. But the paper, I think, is called Men Without Children, and is well worth reading itself.
Yeah, thank you.
It looks like Adrian has a question in the chat.
Oh, yeah. So my man Adrian has asked Dr. Miller, which is weird because when we went to the Bone Thugs and Harmony concert, I wasn't Dr. Miller, I was just Sea-Dog. Sorry, bad joke. Dr. Miller, how would you respond to the claim that greater access to abortion actually decreases abortion rates? So that if we wanted to reduce the harms to women through abortion, we should make it more available, not less. There's a huge amount that could be said about this. I actually gave a conference presentation on this the other day. The short answer is that the idea that abortion decreases abortion rates, or even the idea that abortion access doesn't change abortion rates, is completely academically untenable. There's a mountain of evidence showing that when access to abortion is increased, the abortion rate increases. Very simple examples are the increases in abortion rate when abortion is legalized. When abortion was legalized in the US, the abortion rate went through the roof. When it was legalized in the UK, it went through the roof. In Romania, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Ethiopia, Netherlands, pretty much any country you can think of, when abortion is legalized, the abortion rates increase massively. There have been more careful studies by economists and epidemiologists showing much the same thing. Sometimes they use different measures of abortion access. So some studies have said that Medicaid funding, for example, when Medicaid funding is restricted for abortion, the abortion rates go down. And actually the Guttmacher Institute, the leading pro-abortion think tank in the US, has written a review of all the evidence on this, and they said when Medicaid funding is restricted for abortions, abortions go down. They looked at the same thing for parental involvement laws. They did a review saying what happens when, if a minor wants to have an abortion, their parent has to be involved in some way. Again, they found that the abortion rate goes down. There are a number of other different examples like this. There's a huge ton of evidence. The latest probably is the Turnaway study. This is a study performed by people, I think it's at San Francisco, at the Bixby Center. These researchers studied specifically what happens if a woman is denied an abortion because she's over the gestation limit. So many facilities will have a gestation limit of, say, 20 weeks, and they won't do abortions above that. If a woman is denied an abortion at these facilities, what happens? They found that 75% of women go on to have the baby. So it's not even just a small decrease in abortion, it's a massive decrease in abortion when abortion is made unavailable for various reasons. So yeah, the short answer is that there's basically no empirical evidence that increasing abortion access lowers the abortion rate or even keeps it the same. All the available empirical evidence we have suggests that increasing access to abortion increases the number of abortions, and there's much more evidence that could be mentioned there.
Awesome. Does anyone else have any other questions they want to ask?
I have more, but I don't want to like take up other people's time. So if no one else, I still have like a couple more. No? Okay. So I'll go. Okay. So Dr. Miller. So you had mentioned earlier the character Marie Stopes. Am I like,
Yeah.
and you said there was a controversy surrounding her because of her eugenic past. I don't know if you guys in the UK have Planned Parenthood, but here in the US, we have like a very similar character with also a very similar background. You know, you have Margaret Sanger, who has sort of a eugenicist background as well. Do you think that's a coincidence? And if this is outside your field, right? So this is maybe a more sociological or historical kind of question, but do you think that's a coincidence that these two characters who are abortion advocates also have a eugenicist background, or do you think there's something going on there? So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a good question. So yeah, they're very similar characters. In fact, Margaret Sanger and Marie Stopes, they were both involved in like early birth control movements. They both actually mostly focused on contraception and then privately supported abortion. Because abortion was much less acceptable, they were mostly pushing contraception, but they obviously supported abortion privately. And yeah, they were both active around the similar sorts of times, kind of the early 20th century. Yeah, we do have in the UK, it's kind of odd. We don't really have Planned Parenthood as a domestic abortion provider, but the International Planned Parenthood Federation, which is kind of the umbrella organization, is actually based in the UK. So it's really odd. Their international arm is based in the UK, but yet they don't actually do much in the UK at all. There's a very close link between them, and it's not coincidental at all. So when you look at the early ways of the early pushes to legalize abortion in the beginning of the 20th century, this was very much from a eugenic perspective. And the reason eugenics had kind of taken off around this time is because Darwin's theory of evolution was the end of the 19th century. And of course, this is completely separate to what the theory of evolution actually says. You know, the theory of evolution, I have no problems with. But people had taken that to become something called social Darwinism, which was this idea that we can use Darwin's theory of evolution to create a better species. We can improve the breed of humans, and they would use terminology like breed or stock, often in ways that were horrendously dehumanizing for marginalized groups. So this had become very popular in the early 20th century, and hence a lot of the countries that were the first countries to legalize abortion explicitly included a eugenic grounds for doing so, and they called it a eugenic abortion. So this wasn't just the case in Soviet Union, it wasn't just the case in Nazi Germany, though it was the case in both of those. It was also the case in far more progressive countries like Sweden and Norway didn't legalize it early, Iceland, Sweden and Iceland and Denmark. No matter where a country stood on kind of progressive social reforms or fascism or communism or whatever else, pretty much everyone in the elite sector of society was committed to eugenics. And so Marie Stopes actually was a great admirer of Hitler, because actually the elites in many parts of society, although the elites in, for example, the UK and the US might in many cases have objected to the Holocaust, and of course in many cases they did, what they didn't object to was eugenics. And they constantly praised Germany's eugenics program and thought this was a perfectly fine thing. That wasn't the issue that they took with Nazi Germany. So you have early, so I said Marie Stopes was an admirer of Hitler. When you look at the early Planned Parenthood directors and board members, a lot of them were very, very close friends with German eugenicists. Lothrop Stoddard was one of the early Planned Parenthood directors in the US, and he wrote a book called, I've actually got a slide on it somewhere. That's, yeah, I just found it and then I lost it. He's got a book called The Rising Tide of Color, and the subtitle is The Threat Against White World Supremacy. And he's basically talking about how there's a rising tide of, his words, colored people. And this was perfectly normal within the early Planned Parenthood. The idea that you could be eugenics, that you could be racist, that you could be worried about threats to white supremacy. And it's the same with Marie Stopes. So I don't know exactly to what extent Marie Stopes and Margaret Sanger had a relationship with each other. I think they were friends, but I don't want to promise anything. But certainly the links are very clear, and abortion in the early 20th century was very firmly rooted in eugenic thinking, both in fascist countries like Germany and in progressive countries like Sweden and Denmark. The only other thing I'll say on that is there's a book called Margaret Sanger's Eugenic Legacy by an author called Angela Franks, and she talks about all of this in effect. So she covers all of this ground in a lot of detail and gives a lot of insight into the history of those links. So yeah, absolutely. The short answer is yes, it's not a coincidence at all.
There's a comment.
Oh yeah. Did we already talk about how girls could also help boys and themselves stay pure? I might be misunderstanding the question. So yeah, I think this comes back to the question of how abortion impacts the sexual culture. And I wanted to make it very clear that the pro-life position doesn't depend on any particular view about sex, about how it should be used, about, you know, what circumstances it should be used, and so on. I have pro-life friends who are permanently celibate. I have pro-life friends who love sex with lots of different people. And both of, you know, both of them, I have more than two friends. All of those friends, no matter what their views are that unborn children are members of the human community. And if you're a member of the human community, you have basic human rights, such as the right to life. So I want to be really clear that you don't have to be committed to any particular view about sexual behavior or purity or anything like that, or however you want to phrase it, in order to be pro-life. I did talk about the way in which abortion legalization has changed these sorts of sexual norms, and in a way which, although it's been liberating to some people at the top of society, has been extremely detrimental to people at the bottom of society who are already trodden on by the oligarchs and the powerful for various other reasons. So I don't know really whether ideas on how to help people stay pure, assuming that the question is about, I guess, sexual restraint, if we can put it that way. I don't know whether that necessarily falls into my expertise. It's not really so much to do with, here we go, another comment. I just wanted to, girls dressing immodestly makes it really hard for boys to stay from sex. Yeah, I think as pro-lifers, we have to be, I think, yeah, as I guess speaking of my own experience, and particularly speaking as a male in this context, I'm very wary of any sort of suggestion that male irresponsibility has its roots in female behavior. Now, is it empirically true that some things that women do make men want to have sex more? That's basic fact of sex. Like, people do things to make each other attracted to them. Like, that's not controversial. But I would be very, very hesitant to say anything that came across as suggesting that it was a woman's job or that women were culpable in some way or responsible for men mistreating them or sexually harassing them, or for men lacking restraint. I think we need to be absolutely clear that a man who lacks restraint and who disrespects a woman is in the wrong, and the wrong is on him, and he should be accountable and responsible for that, not the woman who he's harmed. And I think this isn't important for pro-lifers, because pro-lifers are often seen as saying, this is all about a woman and the woman is responsible and it's her fault and she's the one who has to bear the burdens of it. And so I think it is important that we frame these topics in a way that shows that we understand the role that irresponsible and disrespectful and sometimes violent men have to play in abortion, whether it's through unwanted sex, whether it's through refusing to use contraception, whether it's through forced abortion, for example. Men have a huge role in contributing to a culture where abortion is seen as the normal thing to do, or the best way out of a difficult situation. And so I would always want to focus on the side of saying abortion is a societal problem, and that has sometimes roots in powerful oligarchs in society creating a two-child norm for families. Sometimes it has its roots in elevating autonomy above anything else. Sometimes it has its roots in men pressuring women. But I think seeing it as a societal problem that has all sorts of different roots is much more helpful and much more accurate and fair to women than just seeing it as, here's what we want women to do, and here's women being in this situation. So I'm sorry that's a little bit of a rambling answer, and it's a bit of an unclear answer. That's mainly because it's not necessarily my area of expertise, how to get men to behave differently. But I think it is clear that I think we need to say that men do need to be held accountable, and that a lot of abortion is due to men's failure to be responsible. So I hope that at least gives some insight.
Awesome. I have another question, but does anyone want to ask one first?
I have another, but I don't know if someone else wants to speak up.
I'll ask my question. So Calum, as a medical doctor, what is your stance on fetal pain? Like, what week do you think it begins?
Yeah, great question. So I'll start with the kind of the received wisdom or the establishment view, which is that fetal pain is not possible before 24 weeks or 20 to 24 weeks. When fetal pain was brought up about a decade ago, the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, which is basically the UK version of ACOG, the American College of OBGYNs, did a report, and they did a comprehensive review of all the evidence, and they found, or they argued, that fetal pain was not possible before about 20 to 24 weeks, because it was at that time that you had the connections between a part of your brain called the thalamus, which kind of sits around the middle of the brain, and the cortex, which is the kind of outside kind of wrinkly bit of the brain. And in order to feel pain as a conscious person, you needed to have those connections all the way from your fingertip, where you're feeling pain, through to the thalamus in the brain, and then further connections to the cortex. And they said those last connections were not present before 20 to 24 weeks. One of the authors of that report, who's pretty much the world authority on fetal pain, Stuart Derbyshire, he's published a number of other articles on fetal pain in top journals. And if you ever get into a debate on this on Facebook and you ask someone for a reference, they'll probably reference one of his old articles. This is really helpful when it does happen, because he actually changed his mind last year, and he published a paper in the Journal of Medical Ethics saying that actually they found evidence that there are those connections between the thalamus and the cortex from 12 weeks of pregnancy, and that it's quite possible that babies feel pain at that point. He also pointed out that we now have examples where humans don't have a working cortex and they still feel pain. So there was someone who had a stroke, and all of the parts of the cortex which were supposed to be responsible for feeling pain were destroyed, and that person could still feel pain. And so this undermined the idea that you needed the cortex to be functioning in order to feel pain. And so he said for those sorts of reasons, he's changed his mind, and he thinks it's quite possible that fetal pain is possible from as early as 12 weeks. His co-author in that paper, I've spoken to privately about this, and he thinks it's possible that it's even earlier. The reason for that is that the earliest kind of pain receptors in your skin start at about 6 weeks. There's maybe a 1 week leeway before or after. It was about 6 weeks the first pain receptors develop on your skin, and I think it's around the mouth that they develop first. So some people have argued that pretty much as soon as those receptors are there, that they can feel pain, and that's 6 weeks or so into pregnancy, which is about 4 weeks after fertilization. So some people say that it's very, very early, and that most babies who are the victims of abortion feel pain. The pro-choice side will still say 20 to 24 weeks, or most of them will. But the latest evidence suggests that even those pro-choice leading advocates in the world think that it could well be more like 12 weeks now, at which point a really significant number of abortions do happen. So yeah, I hope that gives like a reasonably good overview of the literature at the moment.
So in one of your earlier slides, you said there was a connection between gonorrhea and ectopic pregnancies. So inform me a little bit if I'm mistaken, but from what I understand, ectopic. Okay, well, let me back up. Sorry, I should have organized this question before I asked it. So in my conversations with people who are pro-choice, they'll say, well, what about pregnancies that endanger the life of the woman? And it's my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, that that really only happens in ectopic pregnancies. Is that correct, or are there other cases?
There are other cases. So ectopic pregnancies are about 1 to 2% of all pregnancies. So they're reasonably common. They're not like unheard of, given how many women become pregnant each year. So they're probably the most common, and they're in a sense that one of the simplest cases. But there are cases later on where the woman's life can be endangered by pregnancy, usually from the woman's membranes rupturing too early, which can give a risk of infection, or because a woman becomes their blood pressure becomes extremely high, a condition called preeclampsia. And that can develop into a further condition called eclampsia, which is very, very serious as well. So those are probably the main. Oh, and hemorrhage. Hemorrhage is the leading cause globally, either before birth or during birth or after birth. Just a loss of too much blood can cause mortality. And there's a few other causes, but in a sense, ectopics are the most, well, maybe they're not the most common, but they are common. It's about 1 in 50 to 1 in 100 pregnancies. Sorry, yeah, so I think you had a further bit of your question. So.
Right, yeah. So I was wondering how effective it would be, because if abortion has this increase in, what was it, gonorrhea, and gonorrhea has leads to an increase in ectopic pregnancies, and ectopic pregnancies is like one of the big excuses, or one of the big justifications rather, for the pro-choice side. I wonder if maybe that would deflate that talking point a bit, right? I don't know, what are your thoughts on that?
So to some extent it does, and I think more generally you can say that one of the reasons legalizing abortion doesn't help is because the legalization of abortion contributes to maternal pathology in various ways. So one of these ways is through increasing sexually transmitted diseases, which are responsible for some maternal deaths. Particularly in the developing world, HIV, AIDS, and other STDs are responsible for a significant proportion of maternal deaths, and deaths more generally, particularly HIV, AIDS. And if those are increased in the population because abortion's legalized, abortion contributes to more maternal deaths. One of the other mechanisms, and yeah, the same would be true for ectopics caused by gonorrhea, for example. I don't know how common that is, because if you treat gonorrhea, it should be fine, and you shouldn't have ectopics, as far as I know. Or maybe there's still a risk. I don't know for certain. I can't really say for certain on that. But a lot of sexually transmitted diseases are very much treatable if you treat them at an early stage. So I don't know how many ectopics would be caused by gonorrhea, but probably some. But the other way that legalizing abortion increases, or one of the other ways that legalizing abortion increases maternal mortality, is that people have riskier sex and they have more unwanted pregnancies. And either those unwanted pregnancies are going to end in abortion, which does have some risks, particularly of suicide, or those pregnancies are going to be healthy or not so healthy pregnancies. And so if you imagine, for example, before legalization, someone decides, I'm not going to have any sex with someone when I'm not ready for a baby because I can't get an abortion. Abortion's legalized, that person says, well, now I can always have an abortion, so I'm going to have sex even though I'm not ready for a relationship. She has sex, becomes pregnant, and she decides, well, I'm actually kind of pro-life and I feel like I could take care of this baby. So she has the baby. And then during the pregnancy, she develops one of these complications through premature rupture of membranes or preeclampsia or something else. That woman would never have become pregnant without abortion being legalized, but because abortion is legalized, she's become pregnant, and therefore she's been subject to the risks of pregnancy, like premature rupture of membranes and infection. And so that would be the kind of mechanism that would be at work. And it's likely, we know that when abortion is legalized, the number of pregnancies goes up. And some of those pregnancies will result in life-threatening conditions for women. But on the other hand, it's worth pointing out that we don't want to exaggerate this argument because pregnancy is very, very safe. The chance of dying in pregnancy in developed countries is about 1 in 10,000 pregnancies. We do operations in hospital where the risk is 1 in 10,000, and that's basically negligible. It's not negligible, of course, for those few people who are very, very unfortunate, but it is a very, very small number. And we don't want to kind of inflate the risks of pregnancy in our conversations, just because in developed countries, it is fundamentally a safe, healthy condition for people to be in. And the risk of mortality is very, very low. So, yeah.
Cool, thanks, awesome. I think there's questions in the comments.
Oh, sure. How do you prove it is a human at the moment of conception? Yeah, this is a good question. So I've always been kind of amazed that this is seen as a controversial point. As I kind of said earlier, one of the reasons I became pro-life was that I learned fetal development at med school. And when I was at med school, before I became pro-life, so we had embryology in first year, I became pro-life in like 4th or 5th year. But in first year, when I was not pro-life, it was still uncontroversial that a new human being was created at fertilization. If I'd given any other answer in my exams, they would have thought I was crazy. So this was not at all controversial within medicine or within biology. Everyone agreed, all the textbooks agreed, a new human being begins at fertilization. There was actually a study a couple of years ago by a guy called Steve Jacobs, who is a PhD researcher at Chicago. And he surveyed thousands of biologists around the world. And he found that 95% of them agreed that at fertilization, a new human organism is formed. That was 95%. Now, when I raised this in a debate, I had a debate with the CEO of Britain's leading abortion provider. And I said, look, biologists, 95% of them agree that life begins at fertilization. And she said, I can't believe you said that. I'm amazed that you brought this point up. And I was like, oh gosh, what's she going to say? And she said, I'm amazed it wasn't 100%. This is a basic biological fact. So I think, people who are honest and who know the basic science will all say that it's a new human being at fertilization. What they really want to say is that it's not a person, and that to be a person requires more than just being a human being. It requires being sentient or having a particular level of consciousness or being rational or autonomous or whatever. But the basic fact, the biological fact of when an organism begins to exist is uncontroversial, really, within biology and medicine. The actual reasons biologists give for this are a bit more nuanced, and there is actually a bit of debate about what exactly is it that means this is a new organism. Obviously, the fact that it has a completely different genetic code is really significant. The fact that it's yeah, it has different mother and father to any of the other cells in a woman's body. The fact that from that point, it has a kind of a development plan and a blueprint for forming a human being. From the very start, it kind of knows exactly what's going on, and all the mechanisms are in place to ensure that as long as it develops healthily, it will become a mature adult human being, and so on. So there's a bit of discussion about what is it exactly that makes biologists think this. There's a couple of papers on this. So Maureen Condick, I'll put her name in the chat for anyone who's particularly interested. She's written a huge amount about this. And then I actually have a journal paper, which I'll type the title of as well, which argues from a more philosophical perspective that humans begin to exist at fertilization as well. Sorry, that's the one I wrote. But yeah, the basic fact I think is all you need, which is that biologists are overwhelmingly agreed that this is a scientific fact. The only other thing I'd say on that is it helps in conversations if you are kind of overly charitable to the other person. So you actually gently and in a way that's not too condescending, explain to them what they are trying to say or what they should have said. So you say, actually, it's uncontroversial that a human being in the biological sense begins at fertilization, but maybe you want to draw a distinction between human beings and persons. And you want to say that a human being begins at fertilization, but it's only later when it becomes conscious or something else that it becomes a person. And that's something we can legitimately debate about, and let's debate that. And if you kind of explain the concept a bit more clearly to them and you help them with their argument, it can make things clearer when you're talking. It can make you look charitable and open-minded. And it also allows you to establish the basic biological fact, which shouldn't really be disputed at all, which is that they begin at fertilization.
Awesome. Does anyone have any more last-second questions before we finish up?
I don't have a question. I do have a comment, if that's okay.
As long as it's
go ahead.
Okay, so Dr. Miller. So I'm a student here at Cal State University Long Beach, and I've been to a number of abortion talks here on campus, especially from like the pro-choice side, mostly held by the women's department, the women's and gender studies department. And in the past, they've advertised like Dr. So-and-so is going to talk on abortion and how it like helps women and all these things. And then it turns out like their doctorate is not like a medical doctorate, which you would think, right, is the relevant credential to have. But no, they're like doctors in like women's studies. So I think you are the most qualified speaker on abortion Cal State Long Beach has had, to my knowledge. So hats off to you. I'm glad you're here.
Well, thank you for that. It was very kind. Yeah, to be honest, most doctors are pretty clueless about this as well. So I wouldn't necessarily, yeah, I mean, from my own experience, as I said, like when I debate with other doctors in the UK about this, they have completely insane beliefs. Like you wouldn't believe the kind of crap that I hear from other doctors who are apparently well qualified. So I wouldn't necessarily put a great deal of faith in credentials. But yeah, I mean, it does help, of course, knowing some medicine. So I'm glad it has been, well, at least I hope it's been helpful. And thank you so much for inviting me and for having the patience to listen to me for so long, to everyone who's here.
The British accent makes it easier.
Awesome. That was a fantastic presentation, Calum, and thanks for coming out. So where can people find some of your other work?
Yeah, thank you for the invitation for that. So I have a blog, which to be honest, I don't keep that up to date. It's just called Calum's blog. It's possible to just add me on Facebook. Facebook's probably what I use more than like, I mean, Twitter's full of insufferable people, so I generally try to avoid it. Like, yeah, if you have any questions, Facebook is pretty simple. there's like various videos on YouTube, but I don't have my own channel or anything. So just search Calum Miller and hopefully something should come up. But yeah, if you want to stay in contact and hear more updates, then Facebook is probably the best way for that.
Nice. Also, I just want to thank everyone else who made it tonight. And I'll have the recording of this event uploaded on our YouTube channel within a day. And I hope everyone has a good night and God bless.